the theme is gardens, and tonight a Renaissance view of the Garden of Gethsemane.
This picture was painted late in the 15th century by one of the greatest of Italian Renaissance painters, Giovanni Bellini. Giovanni was a master storyteller, and the narrative is remarkably subtle. It's been a long night. A young man has struggled to settle himself on the bare ground. He cradles his head and sinks off to sleep despite the sharp pebbles beneath him. His small parcel of wasteland is shared by two others, one propped against a rock, the other flat on his back, mouth open, exhausted. They weren't expecting to sleep rough. They've got no packs of food, no water bottles, and none of those woven rugs that nomads carry with them to improvise shelter and warmth. They could easily have made the few extra steps out of the desert into the nearby pasture. Yet they ignored the invitation of its carefully weeded path. So close to habitation and its comforts, somehow they've ended up passing the night on the edge of civilization, like people who don't quite belong. In fact, the choice wasn't theirs, which accounts for their lack of preparation. They were brought here by the man kneeling on top of the crag, gazing off into the distance. For this is the Garden of Gethsemane, and it is Christ who stares up at a cup, held by an angel, transparent against the sky. The cup takes the form of a chalice and presents to him a declaration of his imminent crucifixion. His understanding of the supernatural message is contrasted against the blind sleep of his apostles. Humanity snores on, oblivious. There's a rather wry comparison between the immovable rock that Christ is kneeling on and the limp sprawl of Peter, the rock on which the church was to be built. But the first and most basic quality of his art at this stage of his career was the sharpness of his drawing. The contours around these apostles look almost as if they're etched into the panel. Giovanni Bellini came from one of the best-known artistic families which Venice ever produced. He was still a young man when he made this painting, still much influenced by his brother-in-law, Andrea Mantegna. The whole character of the central part of the painting, the way the shapes express the harrowing experience of Christ, his coruscated drapery, the rocks sending up a plea to the sky, all this is Mantegnesque in spirit. By coincidence, the National Gallery also owns a painting of the same subject by Andrea Mantegna. A glance at it shows the similarities. The pose of Christ back to us as we look in at the picture. The sharply cut, chiseled out rocks. The emphasis on bravura foreshortening. The trail of captors. But there's a world of difference in the emotional content of the two pictures. Mantegna's scene is doom-laden. His Christ is presented not with the cup that will save humanity, but with instruments of torture. The cross, the lance, the column of his flagellation. The sky above him is ominous. A vulture waits in an olive tree. Mantegna concentrates on the suffering of Christ. The reassuring dawn, which symbolizes the dawn of Christianity, is practically invisible in a corner of an otherwise tragic landscape. This optimistic future, still only a blush of promise in the picture by Mantegna, is the principal feature of Bellini's painting. Almost before we are conscious of what's actually going on, we are warmed by the light which bathes the lush countryside. Gradually, we become aware that Giovanni has built an extra dimension into the story, has developed a contrast between the barren site of the Agony and the verdant panorama beyond. The transition between the two is managed in masterful fashion. Look at the way paths close to the crag writhe like snakes in torment, only to convert their rhythm into something altogether more peaceful and controlled. Giovanni's reconstruction of the valley around Jerusalem has a lot in common with the Italian mainland near Venice. Townships glow warmly as if carved from ivory. Some buildings approach incandescence, and as they shine, so do the disciples. Unknown to them as they sleep, they are transfigured by light and color. In his time, Bellini was the most important artist in Venice. He is credited with introducing into Venice the technique of painting in oil. Hitherto, tempera had been the medium usually employed by Venetian panel painters. Oil dries more slowly than tempera and makes it easier to blend different colors. It's rather more suited to rendering effects of luster and reflection. Now, Giovanni's major achievement isn't actually dependent upon the oil medium's interpretation of light, but it obviously helped him to see light differently, and through this, to discover his own individual form of landscape. He put the sky into painting. What he creates here is more than simply accurate, more than just a map. It's an evocation not just of a particular place, but a vision of it at a particular moment in time. It is dawn. The dawn works on several levels. Descriptive, it tells us the time. Symbolic, it refers to the dawn of Christianity. And emotional. This early example of panoramic landscape painting is there not just for us to contemplate the beauty of nature. It plays a particular part in the narrative. In the foreground, Christ suffers for the world. In the background, we see that world warm, lush, and beautiful. Everyone who painted the sky from this time on can be thought of as a descendant of Bellini, even Turner. Giovanni Bellini taught not just artists, but the whole world that the sky over Venice was as unique as the city itself. So perhaps it was this painting which gave rise to the idea that nature imitates art.
When Claude Monet began painting landscapes entirely out of doors in the 1850s and 1860s, he was considered eccentric, like a composer who might wheel his piano into the forest to write a sonata. You were supposed to paint in a studio, where you could employ your skills to improve on nature. The practice of taking nature neat, so to speak, was thought by the art establishment to be not only eccentric, but downright corrupting. And in 1867, the jury of the Paris Salon felt it was time to clamp down on these young painters and exclude them from exhibiting their work in public. One of the jury members of the Salon was asked why he'd rejected a painting by Monet when he had seemed to be showing such progress. To which the answer came, "It is precisely because he is making such progress that I am turning him down. Too many young people think only of pursuing this abominable direction. It is high time to protect them and save art." The main painting by Monet that was excluded that year was this one. It's Women in the Garden, and to me it is one of the most purely radiant of all Monet's early outdoor pictures. Certainly it is pretty hard to see how in any way it could be thought of as a corrupting influence. Well, so much for juries. I think a more likely reaction today is, how did he manage to paint quite so large a picture out of doors? Well, we know the answer. Monet, in fact, had a trench dug in the garden of the house outside Paris which he'd rented. And alongside the trench was a pulley system which could raise and lower the canvas to the right height. All this, I might say, to the utter astonishment of his friends. One of these friends was the older painter Gustave Courbet. Courbet half understood what Monet was doing because 15 years earlier he'd painted a picture of his three sisters out of doors. The difference being that Courbet had actually painted it in the traditional manner, in his studio, from sketches done out of doors. Where Monet did learn from Courbet's example was the older man's insistence that a painting should be about real life just as you experienced it. You painted to please yourself, not art juries, who were beyond pleasing anyway. This attitude is, I think, what gives Monet's picture its freshness. It's as if we have ourselves just stepped into Monet's garden on a summer evening and were enjoying the way sunlight picks out the foliage in 100 different shades of green, making the white roses almost luminous and the red gladioli brilliant torches. Monet's affection is even warmer towards people, these simply but beautifully dressed women who are themselves like gorgeous flowers. Never in his life did Monet paint more radiant pictures than at this time. Some months earlier, he had undertaken an even larger painting out of doors, this time in the forest of Fontainebleau. And again, it's imbued with Monet's delight at the effects of sun on foliage and delight at the company. The painting is only a sketch, even though it is 6 feet across. The finished work was 20 feet across, but he left it with an innkeeper in lieu of rent, and the innkeeper rolled it up in a damp cellar until it rotted. Later, Monet could only retrieve 2 fragments. In the second fragment, the seated male figure looks remarkably like Gustave Courbet, who was so critical of all this out-of-doors stuff. Courbet with an extra twirl of the moustache, slightly to send him up, maybe. And the solemn-looking girl handing out the picnic plates, who is she? We have seen that white polka dot dress before. She is the girl reaching out to pick a rose in the painting of Women in a Garden. And her name is Camille Doncieux, and she is Monet's future wife. Actually, Camille is wearing a blonde wig. Her hair was naturally dark. All the women in the picture are Camille. She has posed 4 times in 4 different dresses. So it's not a group at all, but a portrait of one woman, deployed in such a way that she appears to move as if on a turntable round the central tree. The whole picture is a homage to her. Monet's landscapes at this period, in the late 1860s, are gardens of love. Life is an unbroken summer picnic. What is extraordinary is how little Monet's art reflects the actual circumstances of his life. Without this man, the painter Frédéric Bazille, who was relatively well off, Monet might have starved. Not only did Bazille give Monet lodgings when he was down and out, he also agreed to buy this picture. And he agreed to pay a rather handsome sum of 2,500 francs, which was payable in monthly installments over a period of 4 years. In fact, Monet was utterly broke at this time. And it's rather extraordinary when you look at a painting like this to realize that in a summer of such apparent bliss, Monet actually had to abandon his house and garden in order to escape his debts. This picture he took with him, but 200 others he slashed in order to keep them from his creditors. He was so broke that he felt that he had to accept his father's ultimatum to abandon Camille for the time being, even though she was pregnant, and to go back to the family house on the Normandy coast near Le Havre. And here he painted this study of Monet Senior sitting complacently under the French tricolour and enjoying the comforts due to a prosperous grocer in yet another garden. In spite of his father's opposition, Monet married Camille in 1870, and she shared his poverty until her death in 1879, by which time the term Impressionist had been coined and Monet was claimed as a leader of the new school. When Camille died, Monet wrote this to a friend: "I come to ask you another favor, to retrieve from the pawn shop the locket for which I am sending you the ticket. It is the only souvenir that my wife had been able to keep, and I should like to tie it round her neck before she leaves forever." Monet married again, but for some reason his second wife never became the focus of his painting as Camille had been. Now, I don't want to suggest that Monet's work deteriorates after the death of Camille. Obviously, some of the great Impressionist series are still to come, the Haystacks, Rouen Cathedral, and the great Water Lily series at the end of his life. And these are miracles of perception. But for me, there is something missing. And I think it's a concern for people as people, which goes out of Monet's work in middle age, and it never returns. His friend, the French statesman Georges Clemenceau, recalled Monet telling him how, even on Camille's deathbed, what he perceived more than anything else were the different colorations of her face in death, and how horrified the painter was to find himself such a prisoner of his own eyes. The lady with the parasol from the late 1880s scarcely has a face at all. She might be anyone, or a ghost in a pretty dress on which the light and shadows fall, because it's these infinite subtleties of tone which are now the real subject of the picture. Monet's later paintings of gardens are, it's true, gorgeous symphonies of colour and light, but they are empty of humanity. In the springtime of his life, there were flowers in the garden too, but they were also gardens of love.